IVM.
We are here to remind you to pay your credit card bills because paying on time is a good policy. Credit Power Play gives you a chance to win 100% cashback during the first 6 overs of both innings of any IPL match. Just pay your credit card bill and stand to win 100% cashback. Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. I am Ameera Rao, and I am joined by Mr. Anand Arni and Lieutenant General Dr. Prakash Menon. Today, we will be talking about a very complex and prolonged issue, brokering a peace deal in Afghanistan. So, to give you all a brief introduction or a brief background about this, the US, which has had a military presence in Afghanistan for 2 decades, is finally ready to leave. President Biden's decision to end the war would entail pulling out all American troops out of Afghanistan. According to senior administration officials, troop withdrawals would begin before May 1st and conclude before September the 11th. As you may already know, September 11th marks the 20th anniversary of the deadly terrorist attacks that occurred in the US. Now, the question remains, with the exit of the US, will the settlement that follows be durable? And can the Taliban and Afghanistan government work to broker a power-sharing deal? So, with no further introduction, welcome General Menon and Mr. Arni to this episode of All Things Policy.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ameera.
So, the first and most basic question I'd like to address to the both of you and I'd like to ask is, what does a US exit from Afghanistan essentially imply for the nation itself and its major stakeholders? So I am asking you, what are the implications from a US perspective and why have they made this decision now? How do you see the Biden administration handling this? And what are the major differences you see between the Trump administration's handling of this and the Biden administration's? Because from what I know, the Biden administration is still a bit wary of their decision to pull out all troops from Afghanistan, with one side saying that troops should stay beyond May 1st, and with the other side saying that this could be dangerous to foreign forces as it could lead to attack on their forces. So, just in a basic manner, could you explain to us what are the implications from a US perspective and how can the Biden administration handle this? We can start with you, General Menon.
Yeah, I think as far as the decision of Biden to pull out and the Americans are concerned, I think the major geopolitical implication is that its efforts can be focused towards what is its prime competitor, potential adversary, or whatever you want to call it, China. It is the realization that the fundamental reason why they went into Afghanistan, about preventing it from being a terrorist base for attack on the US, especially through Al-Qaeda. And now possibly you can say the ISIS and other extremist groups. They have assessed that that major threat has been dealt with. Of course, this can always be contested, but this is the reason I think which has been advanced, and it really has certain amount of, let's say, truism in it. 20 years, several $1 trillion. And I think the American economy will benefit. Most of the American people would probably heave a sigh of relief. There would always be a veteran's emotion that eventually, after so much of blood and sacrifice of life, we are leaving without actually doing what we came here for. And that is what is in dispute. Biden's argument is, we didn't come here to actually, initially, to try and resolve the Afghan society and its problem which are historical in nature, and including what became known as the mission creep about gender, about women's education. Those were not the initial reasons why improving corruption. They were not the initial reasons why the Americans went to USA. So the fundamental argument that therefore we should leave can be justified. But the point is, America, the toughest, the strongest state in the world, is leaving the battlefield to the stronger enemy, which I would in fact not agree with that, but to the enemy that it has fought to fight their own battles. That eventually, the main stakeholder here who's going to lose is actually the Afghan government now in power. The progress which Afghans have made in education, in women rights, and so on, all that obviously would be under threat, is what the notion is when Taliban comes to power. So, from the point of view of, let's say, human values, of protecting, being the protector of a large part of the Afghan people who actually only want peace, who are caught in the middle, America says, we have tried, now we can't do it anymore. It is not worth for us. And I think 3 American presidents have tried it. Biden will see it as a feather in his cap. He couldn't have done it without having his appointment picks, especially the defense secretary and the secretary of state being on board, because all the time, even when the presidents wanted to withdraw from Afghanistan, it was the Pentagon which held the president's hand, because they believe that there's always a way out, but they've been given 20 years, and I think American presidents have now lost the patience with what the American military has told their political leaders. So they decided to discard the advice, because even now they're talking about the fact that we must leave something behind, these elements of intelligence and so on. And they have also said that there's a threat while America is withdrawing from there. Okay, but now those are not issues. But the Pentagon can say what it wants. Biden has decided. And I think as far as the stakeholders are concerned, the other stakeholders, so the Afghan people are going to suffer for some time, because obviously it's going to lead to a clash, because this withdrawal is going to take place without an agreement most probably, without an agreement between the Afghan government and the Taliban. That's, although Americans are supposed to have put that in place, and then probably, so that's not going to, highly unlikely to happen. Although by 11 September, which is of course a very symbolic date for them, one should not rule out the possibility. And I think Anand would know more about such things. But I would also like to say that Pakistan would be elated and disappointed in many ways. Elated because they would think that because they are now denying it, their strategic depth policy and control of Afghanistan could be possible through the Taliban. Secondly, they would be disappointed that they would lose the leverage they had on the United States of America because of the dependence of US, of Pakistani support for keeping the troops fighting in Afghanistan. So they gain some, they lose some. And as for us, we are concerned, I think we would be better off. Pakistan would not have so much leverage over the US. And we've always been saying the process must be Afghan-driven and Afghan-led. I don't know whether I'm using the correct terminologies. We must leave the situation now to the Afghans to try and resolve in whatever way they want to do it. And I'm telling you, if you look at the historical ways that they have tried to keep themselves together, the type of pacts they make between the tribal communities and so on, they are people who probably know diplomacy and negotiation more than any other country in history, although we may not recognize them as such. So the point is that if the US, with the help of Russia, China, can hold Pakistan's hand, and this is a big if, about intervening in Afghanistan, I think this would mean a lot for the Americans, because 10 years down the line, they can probably claim victory And the Democrats can say it was Biden's decision which actually made it possible. So I think I've spoken enough. Anand?
Before we go to you, Mr. Ani, I completely agree with you, gentlemen, and I think the US being in Afghanistan for the last 19 years, marking 20 soon, is of course a very tiresome war that they fought. So now I want to direct the focus on Afghanistan, and here I want to get your views on this, Mr. Ani. So, speaking of the Defense Secretary of the US, recently a letter had been sent by the Secretary of State to Mr. Ashraf Ghani, who's the president of Afghanistan. And there were some proposals included regarding the power sharing agreement, which included developing principles guiding the constitutional and governing arrangements, as well as a roadmap to a new government and the terms of a permanent and comprehensive ceasefire. So, keeping this in mind, how do you think this peace deal would impact Afghanistan, and what is the future of the architecture of peace and security in the country in terms of evolvement? And what of democracy? Will there be chaos in the future? Can they work in unity? Or is an increase in terrorism in the region inevitable?
Couple of issues here, Ameera. It's not so simple to say. I mean, I think that letter from Jake Sullivan or whoever it was, Blinken, I think it was. Yeah, Blinken was.
Yes, it is linked.
Yeah, it was a last ditch attempt, in my view. Earlier, you remember that Trump had threatened to withhold aid to Afghanistan unless they participated or did what they or engaged in Doha. So this is something similar that you're trying to tell the weaker party that look, you step down and let's look at a power sharing arrangement. To me, that was a last ditch effort by the Americans that failed. And now I don't think there's much progress going to be any point in having that conference in Istanbul or whatever. In any case, the Taliban has said that they will not participate. There are a couple of questions that are thrown up now with this. Since there are no conditions now, it's a conditionless withdrawal. From the point of view of the Taliban, why negotiate with the Republic? And on the other issue is why there's no pressure on the Taliban to sever links with the Al Qaeda. So that's going to be the Taliban victory in a sense. I fear for the worst if this sort of a thing carries on, and if the Americans stick to what they're going to do, which I suspect they would, which is clearly they would be doing, is that there would be civil war. I don't see without a ceasefire. I think the Taliban has used violence, honed it to perfection, and used it to pressurize the Americans and the Afghan government into making concessions. And it's a tried and tested mechanism. Why not? They'll continue doing it. There are more issues that are thrown up, but as we go on, we'll talk about it. Yeah.
Yes. And General Menon, what do you have to say about this? Can peace and security happen in Afghanistan, or are conflicts sort of inevitable with the Taliban continuing their ways?
Peace and security in Afghanistan are not binary in the sense that, the point is that for sure, what Anand said, that the Taliban, after the American withdrawal, because there is now no agreement, it's about getting to Kabul. And that's not going to happen as a process which it'll take its own time, it'll have its own dynamics. We don't know whether during that process also other people will get involved. So many options are actually now on the table. But let us not rule out the possibility that Ghani and the Taliban might wish to talk. But that can only happen if the Taliban cannot depend upon Pakistan. That is the catch. If Pakistan's hand is restrained, or by whatever means that it can, then the Taliban will talk to the government. But their coexistence itself is so difficult that one does not see that as a permanent process, because eventually this is an ideological fight between a particular religious ideology, which is much more extremist, to what is represented by Ghani and quite a lot of Afghans. So I don't think you can bury that ideological battle through temporary agreements and so on. If they are, they will be tactical on both sides. And therefore, it is inevitable that before Afghanistan finds itself, this battle between the ideology and, let's say, not really the liberal, but more towards the centrist of the political spectrum, would actually have to be fought. I mean, there is no option here because the people are divided based on this. After all, Taliban support, which see the weakness in the Taliban now has got two major things. One thing, he cannot push the narrative that we are fighting the foreigner because the foreigner is not going to be there anymore. That's a major strategic loss for the Taliban. Combine this with Pakistan's inability or let's say reluctance to make things happen. Combine this, and then there is a possibility that the Taliban might have to adjust. Right now, the Taliban is frankly intractable in terms that they're not conceding anything. After all, in the Turkey talks, I think they said that we will require more time. They have not said no. So let's get the option. The point is, the Taliban has also got its restrictions, despite the fact that it's been now doing pretty well as far as getting areas under control. It's probably ready to launch some more offensives and so on. But when the political equations change, and especially the fact that they are no longer fighting a foreigner, they have to fight an Afghan, then things will be different. I mean, that's, I think, my opinion.
Yes, I think, Ms. Gentleman, what you said about, the Afghani government, and the Taliban, potentially coming together to have talks and making some progress, that this could only happen if the Taliban is, not so dependent on Pakistan, brings us to a very important question that I'd like to actually ask both of you. So, where regional interests are concerned in this issue, for example, one of the proposals, mentioned by the US was for the UN to conduct a high-level meeting with foreign ministers and envoys from various players in this issue, like China, India, Pakistan, Russia. Of course, uh, all of them have to develop a unified approach to peace. So, having said this, how big of a role do you think regional players can have in bringing about this agreement and bringing the two parties closer together? Where Pakistan is concerned, Pakistan is obviously a close ally to the Taliban, and they have essentially had very close ties with them. So, do you think there is a point of concern here for the other players, like India, for example? This is open to the both of you all, but Mr. Ani, you can go first.
No, I was only saying this that I don't see much scope of any talks between the Taliban and the Republic in the context that there is no meeting ground. The Taliban is stuck to an emirate, and the idea is very simple that in a free and fair election, they're not going to get more than 10-15%. So they'd like to have their rule, and that is through an emirate. They have their own ideas of constitution building. Everything is so complex, so difficult. So they have no idea, formalized idea. So I don't see them moving in any direction in that context. Yes. Um, what does India have to do? Isn't that the second part of your question? Do we have a role there? Is that what you're looking at?
Yes. So
Yeah.
in terms of the regional players, do you think that there could be relationships that could uh, change, cause more friction or bring two regions closer to each other? Suppose, for example, Pakistan and China, or friction between Pakistan and India. So, what is the general implications of this for the regional players in the issue?
For the regional players, I would see that, well, there can be no regional initiative in bringing the two sides together. That's not going to work. Taliban at the present moment controls about 20-25% of Afghanistan, and not the high figures everybody is talking about. What will happen? If there is going to be civil war, there will be a lot of concern brewing, which will come into play, which will figure. I would see that the possibilities of some, I won't use the word civil war, but I would see a possibility of more violence, and I would see the regional countries coming into play. There are regional concerns. Let's start with Tajikistan, which is on the northern side, not this thing. Tajikistan had fallen to the Islamists at some stage, and it was partially through the help of Commander Masood that they came out of that. So there's going to be that concern that people like the Islamic groups could come on their border. So I wouldn't rule out the possibility of some sort of all these regional countries trying to attempt to have buffer zones in their own areas. I see a buffer zone coming up alongside Tajikistan, maybe support to the Shura and Azhar, that is the General Commander Masood's people. I see Uzbekistan playing footsie with Commander Ata, though forces in Mazar-e-Sharif, that is Ustad Ata and Dostam, because their concerns will be the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan. Uh, Iran has its own concerns. Iran would be worried about positioning of people in and around their borders, and of course the 20% share Hazaras in Afghanistan. So there's also already been some sort of a warning issued by the Iranians. I wouldn't call it a warning, but a reminder that their Fatumiyun brigade is available. Their Fatumiyun brigade is those 5 to 10,000 Afghan Shias, the Hazaras, who were used by Iran in the fight against ISIS. So that's come back. So there is these factors will come into play. We will also come under pressure. Pakistan has already got its forces lined up. It's got the Lashkar-e-Toiba, who are now suddenly overactive in Kunar, that is western Afghanistan. They've got the Haqqani network in the south, in eastern Afghanistan. Then they've got the Haqqani network in the southeast. So Pakistan has its proxies ready. There, everybody's will sort of get ready. Whether it leads to tensions, I don't know, or whether it leads to a return to the late 90s, I don't know. That's all up in the air.
Yes, of course. So, General Menon, I'd like to ask you, after what Mr. Ani said, for India and Pakistan specifically. So, India's biggest fear from this deal for US troops pulling out of Afghanistan was that Pakistan would have an increased influence in the region, and if there is increased violence and terrorism in the region, it could affect the relationship between India and Pakistan, and this is the biggest fear. So, what do you have to say about this fear that they have? Is this valid?
Okay, before we get there, I think we need to actually look at the permanent interests of the regional actors in play. Pakistan is the only nation which wants the Taliban actually to be in power in Kabul. And that's because they think they can control them, and they've supported them for so long, and that's well known. China, I think China would be quite unhappy with the US withdrawing, because to keep the US pinned down and open another front for the US actually is good for China, because it weakens in whatever way its effort to confront China in other places. Also, China definitely would not be happy with the Taliban government there, and that is because the Uyghur Muslims and so on. The fact that that is can produce a radical threat. So also is the stance. They have And Russia is very much interested because that's the conduit for radicalization, especially of the Caucasus and so. So Russia's permanent interest is also not there. Iran would actually definitely not want the Taliban to be there because of the famous split in religious ideology, Shia and the Sunni. Iran would have, I think, still prefer to keep the US there because then they can keep leveraging their power better in Afghanistan because there is a foreigner there, that sort of thing. As far as India is concerned, in your question, the conventional logic in India is that finally, if this happens, Taliban will come to power in Afghanistan. Eventually, terrorists will be trained there by the Pakistanis and sent to fight in India. This is the oldest Indian logic. Now, this logic will have to be questioned on two grounds. Firstly, the advantages we get by the US moving from out of Afghanistan. Whatever you might say, if the Pakistanis delude themselves in the mid and the long term that they can control Afghanistan, then I'm afraid they haven't read their history, do not know about Afghan traditions, the sense of honor and so on, which they harbor very deeply. When the US moves out of Afghanistan, Pakistan becomes the foreigner in Afghanistan. So eventually, the fight will be, depending upon how the Afghan situation, between what is the Pakistani ISI military, which is a Punjabi-oriented ethnic composition with the Pathans, with the Afghans. And that will not be easy for the Pakistanis. That can only be to India's advantage. So in my view, US moving out of Afghanistan is therefore opening up the possibility of finally the Afghans sorting out the Pakistanis in Afghanistan itself. That's not bad for India. So that's my view.
Thank you, General Menon. Mr. Ani, would you like
Yeah,
anything to?
I would just say, yeah, I'd like to add here that the Pakistani army is 26% Pathan, and they have been in and out of Afghanistan in as irregulars many times. They've fine tuned it. Most of the ISI generals have been Pathan origin. They speak the language. They have deep ties. They have pressure points on the Taliban. Like, for example, most of the Taliban leadership had family in Pakistan. Uh, those are pressures that are not easy to circumvent. And the other big issue is that in the earlier period, that is in the 90s, as many as 4,000 Pakistani troops were inside, wearing civilian clothes and fighting and things like and in some form or the other, irregulars handling anti-aircraft batteries and things like. It wasn't much of a conflict because these people can merge very easily with the with the Taliban, and they're also been seen as friends of because they're all the same community, the same tribe virtually. The Durand line is to them an artificial thing, so that's an issue. I don't know how that's going to play out in the future, but this gives the Americans. I mean, I've been a long time votary that let the Taliban come to power in Kabul, and Pakistan will find pressure building up on their. I think not only will refugees go around, finance. International funding to the Afghan government will crumble, and Pakistan doesn't have the wherewithal. Plus, as General Menon said, they just need another enemy, and they found a new enemy. That may play out. But I would think that this will play to some extent in the Americans also will find themselves their hands a little free. They don't no longer depend on. They need no longer depend on Pakistan for sending in for access to Afghanistan. They can play. They can start putting pressure on Afghanistan on Pakistan the financial pressures that they've been using so far, Pakistan is broke. They can probably get a lot more concessions coming out of Pakistan if there was to be an American pullout, when there is to be an American pullout. Last point, of course, I will say that I'm not sure how much the Americans are going to leave an open space in Afghanistan. Troops may pull out. There are about 2,500 American troops and about 6,500 NATO forces, say about 10,000 troops in all, not fighting at all. But I would think that the contractors will start emerging now from all over. And you'd see some sort of an American presence continuing even in the days to come. But there is a lot that we should be doing hereafter. But that's for the next question if you look at it that way.
Yes, I think American funding will still continue, right, to the Taliban, in spite of them withdrawing their forces
Continue
from the region.
funding whom? The Afghan government, yes.
Yes.
It will continue. If it is the Republic, which is Ghani's government in power, maybe there'll be some pressure points. Maybe they'll try and squeeze. But if the Taliban come to power in Afghanistan, all bets are off. I don't see much funding coming. I mean, when I say Taliban coming, I mean the Taliban in control of Kabul.
Mm, yes.
Ameera,
Yes, General Menon.
yeah, if I was a planner for Taliban, I would actually make compromises and make a government in Kabul with Ghani. With compromise, because without compromise, not possible. Once I'm inside Kabul, then I will choose my time and place and sort out Ghani and his government. That's the plan I will make.
Okay, General Menon, that is very interesting. But for my final question, I want to go back to the US and talk about, in terms of general strategy, in terms of a grand strategy, do you think that this is a failure of some sort on side of the US by pulling out of Afghanistan and, eventually the consequences of the Taliban taking over? Do you see this grand strategy of the US as a failure? And in a way, do you think that the US is obviously, apart from being in the region for 20 years, it is tiring to fight this war. But do you think the US sees this as a sort of deja vu situation, similar to the Vietnam War, where, when the US gave up and left, the reactions were that, okay, so the US is a superpower and it's failed. So do you see that happening here again, where similar perspectives could occur?
No, it's not a goalpost. It's the whole thing kept changing. The Americans are frankly tired. They came in initially to get rid of the Taliban, and having come in, they succeeded. And then they started this attempt at Bonn to bring in a president from outside and a constitution and a president cast with a government with a president on top and instead of going with the South Asian model of having some sort of power sharing with a prime minister and a president, that sort of an arrangement. Well, anyway, that isn't. I think it's a little blundering around which they did. They're not great at nation building. So certainly, I think around 2005 or so, or probably a little later, they realized that they're not really getting a hang of what's happening, and they're not been able to quite get what they wanted to do. So they changed their thing that they've come in for purely on a counterterrorism mandate, and that they're trying to get rid of the Al Qaeda, and I think started moving in that direction. There was a little bit of there were a lot of fighting skirmishes going on. Later, once Pakistan gave them the exit, that is, in the context of Osama bin Laden, it was written fairly clear that now, see, the scenario has changed, and now the Americans just are tired. They would get out. And that's pretty much what's happened. The Americans have got really tired of the whole thing. They have no stomach in it for fighting. got out. But it's not the Vietnam type of scenario, because in Vietnam, the locals detested the Americans. That is, the Viet Cong was fighting the Americans. Here, there's no fight between the Taliban. For the last year or year and a half, there's been no fight between the Taliban and the Americans. And the Americans are not looked at in a negative sense by the Afghans. So it's not that they're going with it, being pushed out of Afghanistan. They are, yes, being pushed out in a sense, but not like the Russia, the Soviet Union was pushed out of Afghanistan, or they faced in Vietnam. It's a different thing. They're leaving. They're tired and they're leaving.
Yes, I agree. General Menon, what do you think? Do you think this is
They
a
are tired and leaving is actually admission of defeat, but it can always be painted in a different brush. And therefore, America, after all, what has this group done? It has vanquished, or at least had its own terms with the most powerful nation in the world. So that's another story about power itself. But I think I need to make the point that the Afghans are going one the moment the US moves out, then the Afghans are going to look for anybody who looks like the outsider. That will be the natural turn of events. And when that happens, if there are too many Pakistanis around, although Anand seems to say that they have been there before, I think the context now is different because will be the only foreigners. Previously, there were several of them, and that makes a difference. So the point is that US might, of course, they will have to address this withdrawal, and I think it is a move which is actually done very late. But the point was the Americans, what Biden is saying is also right. We did not go there to actually root out the problems which created extremism itself. And those problems lie rooted in poverty, maleducation, ill health, and so on. The moment the mission creep happened and they got into the other areas, because that actually was the long term, that if you can solve these problems of Afghanistan, then extremism, fundamentalism will also be reduced. And this was the belief. It doesn't matter what the strength of Islam is in those areas, but this Americans firmly believe. So, on that count, we must admit that the Americans have contributed a lot, and a lot of progress has been made in Afghanistan, despite all the machinations of the Taliban itself, even in terms of gender equality and education, medical care, and so on. So that's definitely an American contribution. And but the fact is that they are leaving, and it's never too late to leave. And they just give it to the people of Afghan to try and sort this out. And I'm sure the people of Afghanistan are going to surprise all of us who think that the worst is going to happen to the Afghan people. But if you look at their history, they can manage to actually come out of the worst of situations because they are flexible, they can adjust. Right now, the Taliban is looking inflexible, but there's just a posture which they've adopted because they know that the Americans will leave sooner or later. That they are sure of. That's why they always used to say, the Americans have got the watch, we have the time. So their time has come.
yes. Well, on a slightly positive note, to add to your point, I think, well, at the end of the day, it is up to the Afghan people to handle the situation. And of course, you know, foreign interference has been uh, going on for a long time now. So I think it's just for us to wait and see how it plays out. So, any final points you'd like to make, Mr. Ani?
I think we have to, from the Indian context, we have to start now taking our say, flags out and semaphoring. We have to start signaling if we want to play in some manner or the other. We have to move fast in the context of Chabahar because that will give them an entry point, that will give them an alternate route. And once you have an alternate route, you are less dependent on Pakistan. Pakistan has been great at lulling, seducing, or blackmailing, or whatever you call the Americans, and they would try that again. There would be some attempt. You can say, the Pakistanis will say that we'll make a last ditch effort or something like that. I'm not sure it's a plan or whether it will work for them or not. And yes, in a sense, it would be a problem for Pakistan if the Taliban come to power. But I don't think it's going to be an easy thing. The Afghan National Army is capable of fighting. It's just that there have been other issues. I think it's not going to be a total walkover for the Taliban. There are going to be other pressures in the Taliban which will come up. We have to be careful. We have to recognize those troubles. There is the group we're going in a total different direction. I don't want to do that. But I think India has to be ready to do something. We have to re-establish contact with our old friends. I'm not saying we've got to go back to the days of the Northern Alliance, but we need to be alive to what is happening. We need to revive contact with our friends. That's about it. Yeah.
Well, I think we have covered the answers to a lot of important questions. And on that note, I would like to thank you, Mr. Arni and General Menon, for joining me on this episode. And yes, we shall just see what happens in the future. So thank you for joining me.
The Takshashila Institution is an independent, non-partisan think tank and a school of public policy. We have education programs lasting 1 semester and 1 year that are tailored specifically for people like you. They are all online and you can take them from anywhere. Admissions are now open for our 12-week graduate certificate program in public policy, defense and foreign affairs, technology policy, and health and life sciences. Visit takshashila.org.in/courses to find out more. If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
I hope you enjoyed that show. If you aren't following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. We'd like to thank our sponsors on the network this week, Siet Tires and thewholetruthfoods.com. So this week on Advertising is Dead, Varun was joined by Mansi Zaveri. She shares her experience of running a community for parents of young kids and teenagers and of hosting a podcast along the same lines. Gauri Devidayal was joined by Divya Thani on This Round is on Me. Divya works as a global editorial director with Condé Nast Traveler. They discuss the good, the bad, and the ugly of a travel writer's job. On Candid Kanan, Sid is in conversation with Adarsh Gaurav, who recently scored a BAFTA nomination for his role in the Netflix adaptation of The White Tiger. They talk about his role in the show, life pre and post-stardom, and so much more. On Agla Station Adulthood, Ritash and Ayushi talk about the precious time and opportunities lost to the lockdown and share their post-COVID wish list. When it comes to cricket this season, we have you covered. In English, we have Edges and Sledges, which do their show live on YouTube. They look for announcements over there. And for our Hindi listeners, we have Khel Niti, hosted by Rajiv Mishra and ex-Indian cricketer Sabah Kareem. This show is live streamed on YouTube every day at 9:15. Definitely do check these out and hope to see you again next week.
Come learn and experience the ABCDs of being queer with me, Shunetro,
and me, Farhad,
on our show Gay BCD.
The two of us take you through our stories and experiences of being gay men in the city of Mumbai and have candid
and sometimes downright scandalous
conversations about sexuality, gay culture, and everything in between.
Catch new episodes of Gay BCD every Tuesday on the IVM Podcast website, app, or wherever you get all your podcasts from.